The morning briefing room at Kandahar Air Base fell silent when Major Cassandra Reaper Blackwood walked in. Not because of her rank, not because of her gender, but because of what happened 3 days ago over the Hindu Kush Mountains. The SEALs had been trapped for 18 hours, pinned down by Taliban fighters in a valley so narrow that standard close air support was impossible. The terrain made it a death trap, steep canyon walls rising 2,000 feet on either side, with the enemy positioned on the high ground. Every pilot who'd attempted support runs had been forced to abort. Too dangerous, too low, impossible angles. But Cassandra had heard the desperation in the ground controller's voice crackling through her headset. Any station, this is Bravo 7 actual. We have 12 souls on the ground, heavy contact, danger close. We need immediate air support or we're going to lose everyone. The coordinates put them in what pilots called the Coffin Run, a canyon so tight that flying through it was considered tactical suicide. The mission commanders had already written off the SEAL team. Extraction wasn't possible, air support wasn't feasible, they were ghosts. That's when Cassandra keyed her radio with those 4 words that would echo through military aviation history: Reaper 2-1 inbound. The air traffic controller's response was immediate and sharp. Negative, Reaper 2-1. Area is declared no-fly. Terrain advisory in effect. But she was already banking her Thunderbolt II toward the mountains, the twin engines of her Warthog growling like a predator sensing wounded prey. The aircraft's titanium bathtub cockpit wrapped around her like armor as she dropped to 500 feet, then 300, then lower. What happened next defied everything the Air Force taught about minimum safe altitudes. Cassandra threaded her 30-foot wingspan through a canyon barely 60 feet wide at points, her wingtips clearing the jagged rock faces by mere feet. The Taliban fighters never saw her coming until the GAU-8 Avenger cannon unleashed its devastating 30 rounds, each shell the size of a beer bottle, fired at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The distinctive BRRRT sound of the cannon echoed off the canyon walls like thunder trapped in stone. 12 Navy SEALs went home to their families that night because a female Air Force major did what everyone said was impossible. But now, sitting in this briefing room, Cassandra could feel the weight of their stares. Some held admiration, others held skepticism. Most held the same question that had been whispered through the base for 3 days. How did she survive that run? The operations officer cleared his throat and activated the wall-mounted display. Satellite imagery of the Hindu Kush filled the screen, showing the canyon where 12 American warriors had faced certain death. Colonel Marcus Reed, the wing commander, stepped forward with the bearing of a man who'd seen too many young pilots die attempting impossible missions. His weathered face showed the kind of respect earned through blood and aviation fuel, but his eyes held something else, a mixture of awe and concern that Cassandra had seen before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reed began, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in combat aviation, "what Major Blackwood accomplished 3 days ago shouldn't have been possible. According to every tactical manual, every safety protocol, and every piece of conventional wisdom we've accumulated over decades of close air support operations, that canyon run was a death sentence." He paused, letting his words sink in among the assembled pilots and ground controllers. The minimum safe altitude for that terrain is 1,500 feet. Major Blackwood's telemetry data shows she maintained an average altitude of 80 feet throughout the engagement. A younger pilot in the back row, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, call sign Hotshot, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd been one of the loudest voices questioning whether Cassandra's success was skill or just insane luck. Morrison had graduated top of his class from pilot training, accumulated more flight hours than any other lieutenant on base, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his own press releases. But 3 days ago, when the SEALs were dying in that canyon, Morrison had been the first pilot to declare the mission impossible and request permission to abort. The angle of attack required to maintain controlled flight at that altitude while simultaneously engaging targets on elevated terrain, should have resulted in immediate terrain impact. Reed continued, advancing to the next slide. The image showed Cassandra's flight path traced in red against the canyon topography, a serpentine line that seemed to defy the laws of physics and aerodynamics. Yet somehow, Major Blackwood not only survived the run, but achieved a 98% target destruction rate, while operating in what we now officially classify as a no-fly zone. Cassandra sat motionless in the front row, her dark eyes focused on the tactical display. She wore her flight suit with the same quiet confidence she brought to everything else, no flashy patches, no ego-driven call signs embroidered in Gothic font. Just her name tape, wings, and the small American flag on her shoulder. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and the only indication of the stress she'd endured 3 days ago was a barely visible tremor in her left hand, a tremor that only appeared when she was completely still. The truth was, Cassandra had been underestimated her entire military career. She'd grown up in rural Montana, where her father ran a crop-dusting operation out of a grass airstrip behind their farmhouse. While other kids were playing video games, she was learning to read wind patterns, navigate by landmarks, and fly aircraft so low that jackrabbits had to duck. Reed clicked to the next slide, showing the SEAL team's position during the engagement. Red dots marked enemy positions along the canyon rim, while blue dots showed the trapped American forces clustered in what tactical manuals called a kill box, a geographic area where the enemy held every advantage. The ground team had been under continuous fire for 18 hours. Standard close air support doctrine requires a minimum safe distance of 600 meters between friendly forces and target areas. The SEALs were surrounded. Any conventional attack run would have resulted in friendly fire casualties. Lieutenant Morrison finally spoke up, his voice carrying the kind of skepticism that comes from book learning without battlefield experience. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the flight data doesn't match standard performance parameters for the A-10 at those altitudes. The aircraft shouldn't have been able to maintain controlled flight, especially while engaging targets. Are we certain the telemetry is accurate?" The room fell silent. It was the question everyone had been thinking, but no one had been brave enough to ask. Morrison's implication was clear. Either the data was wrong, or Cassandra had somehow fabricated her success. The young lieutenant's face flushed red as he realized the weight of his accusation, but he pressed forward with the arrogance of youth. "I mean, the physics just don't add up. No pilot, regardless of skill level, should have been able to pull off that kind of precision flying in those conditions." Cassandra turned slowly in her chair to face Morrison, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and carried the authority of someone who'd proven herself in the crucible of combat. "Lieutenant, have you ever flown close air support in mountainous terrain?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Morrison's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "No, ma'am, but I've logged over 800 hours in the A-10, and I understand the aircraft's limitations." "Understanding limitations and pushing beyond them are two different things," Cassandra replied, her tone neither condescending nor defensive. "The physics work fine when you stop thinking like a textbook and start thinking like a pilot who refuses to let American warriors die because something seems impossible." Colonel Reed stepped forward before the exchange could escalate further. "The purpose of this briefing isn't to debate the validity of Major Blackwood's actions. The mission was successful. 12 American lives were saved. What we need to understand is how to replicate this success while maintaining acceptable risk levels for future operations." He gestured toward the tactical display, where the canyon run was still traced in red against the unforgiving terrain. But Cassandra knew the real question underlying this entire briefing. It wasn't about tactics or training or standard operating procedures. It was about whether a female pilot could be trusted with the kind of missions that male pilots had traditionally claimed as their exclusive domain. She'd seen it before, the subtle skepticism, the whispered conversations, the assumption that her success must have been due to luck rather than skill. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 days ago, when the SEALs were dying in that canyon, gender hadn't mattered. Textbook limitations hadn't mattered. Standard operating procedures hadn't mattered. The only thing that mattered was getting those 12 warriors home alive. But now, in the sterile environment of a briefing room, surrounded by pilots who'd never had to thread an aircraft through a canyon while enemy rounds sparked off their fuselage, suddenly, her gender was the elephant in the room that everyone pretended not to see. Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, the senior enlisted advisor who'd been quietly observing from the back of the room, finally spoke up. Rodriguez had 22 years of experience in combat operations, had seen more close air support missions than anyone else on base, and commanded respect from officers and enlisted personnel alike. When she talked, people listened. "I was the ground controller for that mission," Rodriguez said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I was the one talking to Bravo 7 Actual when they made their final transmission before Major Blackwood's arrival. The SEAL team leader's exact words were, 'Tell our families we died fighting.' They had given up hope. Standard doctrine had failed them. Standard procedures had failed them. Standard thinking had condemned 12 American warriors to death in a canyon that everyone declared impossible to support." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Major Blackwood didn't just save those SEALs. She redefined what's possible in close air support operations. And instead of celebrating that achievement, we're sitting here questioning whether it really happened." Rodriguez's eyes swept the room, making eye contact with every pilot present. "I've been coordinating air support missions since before some of you learned to drive. I know the difference between skill and luck. What Major Blackwood did in that canyon was pure skill, backed by more courage than I've seen in 2 decades of combat operations." Lieutenant Morrison's face had gone pale. He challenged not just Cassandra's abilities, but by extension, the credibility of the entire mission record. In military culture, questioning the integrity of a successful combat mission was tantamount to accusing everyone involved of either incompetence or dishonesty. It was a career-ending mistake, and Morrison was just beginning to realize the magnitude of his error. Colonel Reed sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere and moved to redirect the briefing toward more productive territory. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez raises an important point. This mission succeeded because Major Blackwood was willing to operate outside conventional parameters. The question we need to answer is whether we can develop training protocols that prepare other pilots for similar situations without compromising safety standards." But Cassandra was no longer focused on the briefing. Her mind had drifted back to that moment 3 days ago when she first heard the desperation in the ground controller's voice. She remembered the weight of decision pressing down on her like the thin air at high altitude, knowing that 12 men were going to die if she didn't act, but also knowing that attempting the impossible might just get her killed alongside them. The call sign, Reaper, hadn't been chosen randomly. It had been earned during her first deployment to Iraq, when she developed a reputation for finding and destroying targets that other pilots couldn't even see. But the name carried a deeper meaning that most people didn't understand. In rural Montana, where Cassandra had grown up, the term Reaper didn't just refer to death, it referred to harvest time, when skilled operators separated the wheat from the chaff, when the difference between success and failure could mean the difference between a family eating through winter or going hungry. Her father, Thomas Blackwood, had been a crop duster who'd learned to fly in Vietnam as a forward air controller. He'd come home from that war with stories about impossible missions, about pilots who'd pushed their aircraft beyond design limitations to save American lives. Thomas had never directly taught his daughter to be reckless, but he'd taught her something more valuable. He taught her to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. The key to crop dusting, he'd told her when she was 16, and learning to fly the family's modified Cessna ag wagon, isn't following the rules. It's understanding the rules so well that you know exactly when and how to break them without killing yourself. Those words had echoed in her mind 3 days ago as she'd banked her A-10 toward the Hindu Kush Mountains, knowing that every regulation, every safety protocol, and every piece of conventional wisdom said what she was about to attempt was suicide. The briefing continued around her, with various officers discussing potential modifications to training curricula and tactical doctrines. But Cassandra's attention was drawn to a young airman sitting in the corner, Airman First Class Maria Santos, a ground crew chief who maintained A-10 aircraft. Santos had been watching the entire exchange with the kind of intensity that suggested she had something important to say, but lacked the rank to say it in this forum. After the briefing concluded and most of the officers had filed out, Santos approached Cassandra with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I was part of the crew that pre-flighted your aircraft before that mission. When you came back, I did the post-flight inspection." She paused, gathering courage to continue. "Ma'am, I've been working on A-10s for 6 years. I've never seen an aircraft come back from a mission with impact signatures like yours showed." Cassandra raised an eyebrow. "Impact signatures?" Your aircraft had paint scrapes and metal scoring consistent with contact with solid objects. Not enemy fire, actual physical contact. The starboard wing showed evidence of impact with vegetation, and the belly armor had scratch patterns consistent with contact with rock surfaces. Santos lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, according to the damage patterns, you didn't just fly low through that canyon. You made actual contact with the terrain multiple times and kept flying." The revelation hung between them like classified information. What Santos was describing shouldn't have been survivable. A-10 aircraft were tough, designed to absorb tremendous amounts of battle damage and keep flying, but scraping against canyon walls while maintaining controlled flight was beyond the aircraft's design parameters. It suggested that Cassandra's canyon run had been even more impossible than anyone realized. "Airman Santos," Cassandra said carefully, "I trust you haven't shared this observation with anyone else." "No, ma'am. I documented everything in my maintenance log, but I haven't discussed it with anyone. I wanted to talk to you first." Santos hesitated, then continued. "Ma'am, my brother is a Navy SEAL. He was deployed to a different area, but he heard about the mission through military channels. He said the SEAL community is calling you a guardian angel. They're saying you did something that shouldn't have been possible to save American lives." The weight of that statement settled on Cassandra like the G-forces she'd experienced pulling out of her attack runs 3 days ago. She'd always known that military aviation was about more than personal achievement or career advancement. It was about the sacred trust between aircrew and ground forces, the understanding that when Americans were in trouble, other Americans would move heaven and earth to bring them home. But Santos's revelation about the aircraft damage changed everything. It meant that her canyon run hadn't just been tactically impossible, it had been physically impossible. Somehow, she'd pushed her aircraft beyond its design limitations and survived. The question was whether she could do it again, or whether 3 days ago had been a one-time convergence of skill, luck, and divine intervention that would never be repeated. As Santos walked away, Cassandra remained alone in the empty briefing room, staring at the tactical display that still showed her flight path through the canyon. The red line traced across the screen looked so simple, so clean, like a computer simulation rather than a real-world mission where millimeters had separated success from catastrophic failure. She thought about the 12 SEALs who were alive because she'd refused to accept the word impossible. She thought about Lieutenant Morrison's skepticism and Master Sergeant Rodriguez's defense. She thought about her father's lessons about knowing when to break the rules. But mostly, She thought about the responsibility that came with being the pilot who'd proven that impossible wasn't always impossible. 3 days later, the message came down through official channels. A new mission. Another SEAL team trapped in impossible terrain. Another canyon that Standard Doctrine declared a no-fly zone. Another group of American warriors who needed someone willing to attempt the impossible. The mission briefing was held in the same room where Lieutenant Morrison had questioned her abilities. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Word of her success had spread throughout the military aviation community, and pilots from other squadrons had requested permission to observe the briefing. The room was packed with aviators who wanted to understand how Cassandra had accomplished the impossible. Colonel Reed stood at the front of the room with the same weathered expression he'd worn during the previous briefing, but there was something different in his eyes, a mixture of concern and anticipation that suggested he knew exactly what he was about to ask of his pilots. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. 12 hours ago, a special operations team was inserted into the Tora Bora region to conduct a high-value target elimination mission. The operation was successful, but during extraction, their helicopter was shot down by enemy forces. The tactical display activated, showing satellite imagery of terrain that looked even more forbidding than the Hindu Kush Canyon, where Cassandra had made her reputation. Steep mountain faces rose nearly 3,000 feet on all sides, creating a natural fortress that had sheltered enemy forces for decades. The crashed helicopter was visible as a small black dot in the center of what appeared to be an impossibly narrow valley. 8 special operations personnel survived the crash and are currently taking defensive positions around the wreckage. Enemy forces are converging on their location from multiple directions. Standard extraction protocols are not feasible due to the terrain. The valley is too narrow for helicopter operations, and the surrounding peaks are beyond the operational ceiling for most of our rotary-wing aircraft. Reed clicked to the next slide, showing the mission parameters that every pilot in the room immediately recognized as a death sentence. The Special Operations Team has requested immediate close air support to break enemy contact and create a corridor for ground extraction. However, the valley dimensions make conventional air support impossible. The narrowest point is 48 feet wide. The widest point is 73 feet wide. The average altitude above sea level is 8,000 feet, with surrounding peaks reaching 12,000 feet. A collective murmur ran through the assembled pilots. What Reed was describing wasn't just difficult, it was beyond the realm of possibility. Flying through a canyon less than 50 feet wide, at high altitude where thin air reduced engine performance and control effectiveness, while engaging enemy targets positioned on elevated terrain, violated every safety protocol in military aviation. Lieutenant Morrison, who'd been notably quiet since his previous confrontation with Cassandra, raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, those dimensions are narrower than the Hindu Kush Canyon where Major Blackwood conducted her previous mission. Even if someone could successfully navigate the terrain once, attempting it again seems—" He paused, searching for diplomatic language. "It seems like an unacceptable risk." Reed nodded grimly. "You're absolutely correct, Lieutenant. Under normal circumstances, this mission would be declared impossible and the Special Operations Team would be considered lost. However, these are not normal circumstances." He looked directly at Cassandra, who sat in her customary position in the front row. "Major Blackwood, based on your previous success in similar terrain, you've been specifically requested by the Special Operations community to attempt this mission." The room fell silent. Every pilot present understood the implications of what Reed was saying. The Special Operations Forces, the most elite warriors in the American military, had specifically asked for Cassandra by name. It was an unprecedented honor, but it also meant that 8 American lives depended on her willingness to attempt something that everyone knew was impossible. Cassandra stood slowly, her movement drawing the attention of every person in the room. When she spoke, Her voice carried the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. "Sir, what's the timeline for enemy forces reaching the crash site?" Intelligence estimates suggest enemy fighters will reach the Special Operations Team's position within 6 hours. After that point, the team will be overrun and captured or killed. Reed's words hung in the air like a death sentence. And the weather forecast. Clear skies, light winds, excellent visibility. Weather conditions are optimal for flight operations. Reed paused, then added, "If flight operations were possible in that terrain." Cassandra nodded, already mentally calculating flight times, fuel requirements, and weapons loads. "Sir, I'll need 30 minutes to conduct mission planning and aircraft preparation. I can be airborne within an hour." The room erupted in whispered conversations as pilots discussed whether Cassandra was being heroic or suicidal. Lieutenant Morrison looked pale, as if he was beginning to understand the level of responsibility that came with military aviation. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd been observing from her usual position in the back of the room, stepped forward. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, addressing Cassandra directly, "I'll be your ground controller for this mission, same as last time." The statement carried weight beyond its simple words. Rodriguez was volunteering to stake her reputation and career on Cassandra's ability to accomplish the impossible twice. But Cassandra was already focused on the tactical display, studying the terrain features and enemy positions with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient. The valley was indeed narrower than the Hindu Kush Canyon, but it also appeared to be shorter, less than 2 miles from entrance to the crash site. That meant less time exposed to enemy fire, but it also meant less time to line up target acquisition and weapons delivery. The crashed helicopter was positioned in what tactical manuals called a spider hole, a geographic formation that provided natural defensive positions for the ground team, but also created a perfect kill zone for enemy forces positioned on the surrounding high ground. Satellite imagery showed enemy fighters moving along the ridge lines, using the terrain to mask their approach while maintaining clear fields of fire into the valley. "Sir," Cassandra said, turning back to Colonel Reed, "I'll need the most current intelligence on enemy positions and defensive preparations. If I'm going to thread the needle twice, I need to know exactly what I'm flying into." Reed activated the intelligence display, showing real-time reconnaissance data from drone aircraft circling high above the target area. Red symbols marked confirmed enemy positions, while yellow symbols indicated probable enemy locations based on movement patterns and tactical analysis. The display painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated ambush, with enemy forces positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the narrow valley into a killing field. Intelligence estimates between 40 and 60 enemy fighters converging on the crash site, Reed explained. They're armed with small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, and at least 2 crew-served weapons positioned on the eastern ridge line. The enemy appears to be using the same tactics that proved effective against previous helicopter operations in this region. Cassandra studied the enemy positions, looking for patterns and vulnerabilities that might provide tactical advantages. The key to successful close air support in restricted terrain wasn't just flying skill. It was understanding how to use the environment against enemy forces while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. "Sir, what's the armament load for my aircraft?" "Standard close air support configuration. Mixed ordnance including 30 rounds for the GAU-8 cannon, AGM-65 Maverick missiles for point targets, and Mark 82 general-purpose bombs for area targets." Reed paused, then added, "However, given the proximity of friendly forces to enemy positions, you'll be restricted to cannon and Maverick missiles only. The blast radius from general-purpose bombs would endanger the Special Operations Team." That limitation fundamentally changed the tactical equation. Without area effect weapons, Cassandra would need to engage each enemy position individually with precision-guided munitions or direct cannon fire. In a narrow canyon with limited maneuvering room, that meant multiple attack runs through the same confined airspace, a tactical nightmare that multiplied the risk of catastrophic failure. Airman Santos, who'd been quietly observing from the maintenance section seating area, caught Cassandra's attention with a subtle hand gesture. After the briefing concluded, Santos approached with the same nervousness she'd shown during their previous conversation. "Ma'am, I've been working on your aircraft since the last mission," Santos said quietly. "I've made some modifications based on the damage patterns I observed. Nothing that changes the aircraft's basic performance parameters, but small adjustments that might help with terrain clearance and control responsiveness." She paused, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Ma'am, I also installed additional armor plating in areas that showed impact damage from your previous canyon run." The revelation that Santos had been modifying her aircraft based on battle damage analysis showed a level of initiative and technical expertise that went far beyond standard maintenance procedures. It also suggested that Santos understood better than most officers the reality of what Cassandra was attempting. "What kind of modifications?" Cassandra asked. "Enhanced control surface responsiveness, improved engine throttle response time, and additional clearance sensors that will give you auditory warnings when you're within 5 feet of solid objects." Santos lowered her voice further. "Ma'am, I also added a terrain-following radar system that's not standard equipment for the A-10. It'll give you real-time altitude readings accurate to within 6 inches. The modifications Santos described could mean the difference between success and failure in a canyon run, where margins for error were measured in inches rather than feet. But they also represented significant deviations from standard aircraft configuration, which raised questions about regulatory compliance and official approval. "Airman Santos, did you receive authorization for these modifications?" Santos's expression showed the conflict between following regulations and supporting mission success. "Ma'am, I classified them as battle damage repairs and operational enhancements. The modifications fall within my technical authority as Senior Aircraft Maintenance Specialist." She paused, then added, "Ma'am, I'd rather face a court-martial for unauthorized modifications than explain to 8 families why their loved ones didn't come home, because I followed regulations instead of doing everything possible to help you succeed." The statement revealed the depth of commitment that extended throughout the entire military aviation community. Santos wasn't just maintaining aircraft. She was personally invested in mission success and the lives of American warriors. Her willingness to risk her own career to enhance Cassandra's chances of survival demonstrated the kind of loyalty and dedication that made military operations possible. 24 hours later, Cassandra found herself strapped into the cockpit of her modified A-10 Thunderbolt II, conducting pre-flight checks with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through hundreds of combat missions. The aircraft felt different, more responsive, more agile, as if Santos's modifications had somehow enhanced the symbiotic relationship between pilot and machine. The early morning sky over Afghanistan was painted in shades of orange and purple, with the Hindu Kush mountains silhouetted against the horizon like sleeping giants. But Cassandra's attention was focused on the instrument panel, where green lights confirmed that all aircraft systems were functioning within normal parameters. The terrain-following radar that Santos had installed showed as a new display on her right-side console, currently reading the altitude of the runway beneath her landing gear. "Reaper 2-1, this is ground control," Rodriguez's voice crackled through her headset. "You are cleared for takeoff. Weather conditions remain optimal. Current intelligence shows enemy forces are approximately 2 hours from overrunning the Special Operations Team's position." Cassandra keyed her radio. "Ground control, Reaper 2-1 ready for departure. Estimated flight time to target area is 45 minutes. She paused, then added, "Rodriguez, make sure you keep that frequency clear. I'm going to need constant communication during the target run." Roger that, Reaper 2-1. I'll be with you every step of the way. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up to takeoff power, their distinctive whine filling the cockpit as Cassandra released the brakes and began her takeoff roll. The accelerated slowly but steadily, its massive GAU-8 cannon and heavy armor plating making it more tank than aircraft. But as the landing gear retracted and the aircraft climbed away from Kandahar Air Base, Cassandra felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from flying one of the most survivable aircraft ever built. The flight to the target area passed quickly, with Cassandra using the time to review tactical approach options and rehearse the radio communication procedures that would coordinate her attack runs with the Special Operations Team's defensive positions. As the Tora Bora Mountains came into view, she could see smoke rising from the crash site, a thin black column that marked the location where 8 American warriors were making their final stand against overwhelming odds. Reaper 2-1, this is Grizzly 7 Actual, a new voice crackled through her headset. The call sign identified the Special Operations Team leader, a seasoned professional whose calm tone couldn't disguise the desperation of his situation. We have your aircraft in sight. Enemy forces are moving into final assault positions. We need immediate fire support on the eastern ridge line, coordinates to follow. Cassandra banked her aircraft toward the valley entrance, dropping to 500 feet as she approached the narrow canyon that everyone except her considered impossible to navigate. The terrain-following radar was already providing constant altitude readings, its digital display showing the rapidly changing distance between her aircraft and the unforgiving mountain terrain below. Grizzly 7 Actual, this is Reaper 2-1. I have your position marked and am beginning my approach run. Recommend you take cover and mark your defensive perimeter with smoke. She paused, then added, Grizzly 7, I'm going to thread the needle. Keep your heads down and trust me. What happened next would become the subject of military aviation legend, studied in tactical schools and whispered about in pilot-ready rooms around the world. Cassandra dropped her A-10 to an altitude that registered on the terrain-following radar as 12 feet above the canyon floor, her wingtips clearing the rock walls by margins so small that spectators would later swear she was scraping paint off the canyon sides. The enemy fighters positioned on the eastern ridge line never saw her coming until the GAU-8 cannon opened fire, its 30 depleted uranium rounds chewing through enemy positions like a chain saw through timber. The sound of the cannon firing echoed off the canyon walls, multiplied and magnified, until it seemed like the mountains themselves were roaring in anger. But this mission was different from her previous canyon run. The valley was narrower, the terrain more unforgiving, and the enemy more prepared. As Cassandra pulled up from her first attack run, enemy fire began tracking her aircraft, green tracers from small arms and the distinctive smoke trails of rocket-propelled grenades seeking her exhaust signature. Taking fire from multiple positions, she reported calmly, even as her aircraft shuddered from impacts against the armored fuselage. Grizzly 7, I need you to mark enemy positions with laser designation. I'm going back in. The second attack run was even more dangerous than the first. Enemy fighters had adjusted their positions and were now concentrating their fire at the canyon entrance, turning Cassandra's approach route into a gauntlet of bullets and explosives. But she pressed the attack, diving back into the canyon at an altitude so low that her jet exhaust was kicking up dust clouds from the valley floor. The AGM-65 Maverick missiles launched from her wing pylons with surgical precision, each one guided to its target by laser designation from the Special Operations Team below. Explosions rippled along the ridge lines as enemy positions disappeared in clouds of smoke and debris, but more fighters continued to appear, seemingly emerging from caves and hidden positions throughout the surrounding mountains. Reaper 2-1, this is Grizzly 7 Actual, the team leader's voice carried new urgency. We have enemy forces advancing on our position from the western approach. They're using the smoke from your strikes as concealment, We need immediate fire support on our perimeter." Cassandra was already banking for her third attack run when she realized the true scope of the tactical problem. The enemy hadn't just been setting an ambush. They'd been using the Special Operations Team as bait to draw American aircraft into a carefully prepared kill zone. The canyon wasn't just narrow. It was a trap designed to channel attacking aircraft into concentrated defensive fire. The terrain following radar was now showing constant warnings as she maneuvered through airspace that was barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan. Enemy fire was intensifying with each attack run, and she could feel the impacts against her aircraft's armored hull getting heavier and more frequent. But 8 American lives depended on her willingness to keep pressing the attack, no matter what the cost. "Rodriguez, this is Reaper 2-1, she called to her ground controller. "I need immediate intelligence update on enemy reinforcements. The situation down here is getting complicated." "Reaper 2-1, this is ground control," Rodriguez responded. "Satellite imagery shows additional enemy forces moving toward your location from multiple directions. You have approximately 15 minutes before enemy reinforcements make extraction impossible." 15 minutes, 8 American lives, a canyon barely wider than her aircraft, enemy fire intensifying with each attack run. The mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly unfavorable, but Cassandra had never been deterred by unfavorable odds. "Grizzly 7 Actual, this is Reaper 2-1, she called to the Special Operations Team. "I'm going to make one final attack run to suppress enemy positions around your perimeter. After that, you need to be ready for immediate extraction. Ground extraction team is en route to your location." "Roger, Reaper 2-1, we'll be ready." But as Cassandra lined up for what she intended to be her final attack run, the terrain following radar began showing readings that shouldn't have been possible. The canyon walls were closing in, not metaphorically, but literally. What had appeared on satellite imagery to be a straight valley was actually a series of hairpin turns and narrow passes that became progressively more restrictive as they approached the crash site. She was now flying through airspace that was less than 40 feet wide, with her wingtips clearing the canyon walls by distances measured in inches. The slightest miscalculation, the smallest gust of wind, or the briefest moment of inattention would result in catastrophic impact with the mountain walls. But she pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that 8 American warriors were counting on her to deliver them from certain death. The GAU-8 cannon fired continuously as she flew through the canyon, its 30 rounds destroying enemy positions and equipment with devastating effectiveness. But the enemy fire was also continuous now, with muzzle flashes visible on both sides of the canyon, as fighters emerged from concealed positions to engage her aircraft at point-blank range. "Taking heavy fire," she reported, her voice still calm despite the chaos surrounding her. "Aircraft systems showing multiple impacts, but all primary systems remain operational." What she didn't report was that,